Welcome. I'm Joanne Bougalis, speaking on behalf of both me and my mother, Catherine Bougalis. I'm happy to present our story here at the Tampa Guardianship event. Thank you all for coming and participating in this important event. I wish we could be there with you to meet you all. Unfortunately, me and my mother cannot return to the US or we'll both be incarcerated, my mother in a facility and me in jail for accompanying her to freedom. We fled 3 years ago and are living in exile in Greece. The guardianship system nearly destroyed both me and my mother. The situation got so bad that we were forced to run just to survive, for my mother to remain alive. We were left no choice but to take a huge, huge risk. Some people warned us that we better come to our senses and stay in our current situation. We came to our senses and we fled. I value the opportunity to provide insight by sharing our experience of what guardianship actually accomplished for us. My mother and I escaped the tyranny and oppression of the US government condones through inaction. Guardianship is no longer about the ward. It systematically and legally eliminates the ward and the ward's family from existence. It's an excessive invasion using the power of labels, labeling the guardian a professional, labeling the ward with false diagnoses, and labeling family members in a negative light. I myself was called, I was told that I pose a danger, that I'm dangerous. I'm no more dangerous than you. The only danger that I, or anyone fighting for their rights poses, is the dissemination of information exposing the injustices perpetrated against us. My mother said, when my husband died, they came after me just because they could. I had a life, I had a home, I had money. They took everything. Guardianship poses a conflict of interest with one individual overseeing all aspects of a person's life, with the ability to abuse an entire family. As my mother's guardian said immediately after being appointed, I am now your mother. These are the narcissists and psychopaths that have taken over guardianship through legal loopholes, lack of citizen protections, and by infiltrating the legal system through corrupt professionals. It's all about the money. By studying the mafia, at one time caught racketeering, guardians found a way to commit crimes legally. Abusive private guardian organizations operate exactly like the mafia. The entire family is involved in the business. They use threats, intimidation, and payoffs to stay in control. In our case, a professional who documented abuse by the guardian was fired. This caused the other professionals to back down in order to protect both themselves and their organizations. That's how powerful this criminal enterprise has become. The lack of safeguards in the current system has fostered this corrupt climate. The guardian's legal authority is granted by an individual judge. All it takes is for the two of them to agree, which gives them totalitarian authority with no one and nothing standing in their way. In our case, it was family dysfunction that was so perverse, there was no way to avoid attorneys forcing us into guardianship. Not because there was anything wrong with my mother, but just because they could. My mother and I initially escaped family abuse and exploitation by moving from Minnesota to Arizona. In Arizona, she hired an attorney to regain control of her trust. His actions started a chain reaction, causing family members to freeze her assets in Minnesota. Within an 11-month period, the Arizona attorney wrote her trust, deliberately exposed her to further litigation, maneuvered his way into becoming her trustee and power of attorney. He took deliberate steps to elevate her diagnosis and then betrayed her further by requesting guardianship and conservatorship to justify his resignation. A week after my mother was appointed a guardian, he had earned himself enough money to open his own law firm. Attorneys working in family court are not there to help you. They take your funds while feeding you into the system. 5 times I hired attorneys, and 5 times me and my mother were on the losing end. There are payoffs under the table, and you and your family are simply pawns in their chess game. Court hearings were so unrealistic, I would walk out of court saying, "What just happened? Am I in the Twilight Zone?" I fired my first attorney after he changed the paperwork at the last minute, leaving me no choice but to sign papers that were not in my or my mother's best interest. That cost me $40,000. My second attorney coerced, intimidated, and threatened me to manipulate my signature, giving up my right as beneficiary. That only took 3 weeks and cost me $50,000. He later blamed me for signing away my right to inheritance. After that hearing, family members isolated me from my mother again and continued to steal her estate. With no other attorney willing to take our complicated case, I hired the same attorney a second time. When we returned to Minnesota, he pressured me to sign a mediation agreement under duress at 3 o'clock in the morning. Again, not in my or my mother's best interest. Her Arizona attorney pressured her at 3 o'clock in the morning to assign appointing him as her trustee and power of attorney. The same day we signed the agreement, my mother was immediately isolated in her home, forced to have 24-hour caregivers, and forced to sign an order for protection against me. Days earlier in Arizona, we were living free. She was socializing and walking 4 miles a day on her own. Now I had an order for protection to fight, another legal battle. My attorney convinced me to hire him again because he said that the order for protection was so unethical that he would hardly charge me anything. $23,000 later, my attorney purposely failed to win my case in order to continue the order for protection until my mother was under guardianship. My mother's OFP attorney, hired by family members that isolated her, also failed to drop the OFP. My mother was so desperate to contact me, even the healthcare workers helped her sneak calls to me. But I couldn't answer because I couldn't trust if I was being set up again. The attorneys manipulated through intimidation, isolation, coercion, and fear tactics. I told one of my attorneys, "I hired you 3 times, and 3 times me and my mother were on the losing end." His response was that no one will be happy in guardianship, and that I should not embarrass him in front of his colleague, the guardian. I told him I would turn over evidence to law enforcement, and his response was, "You don't want to do that. An investigation would reach far and wide, much farther than anyone would want." I had done nothing wrong. I turned my report in, but I learned quickly that the players had nothing to worry about. Law enforcement treats you like you're a disgruntled family member that's uncooperative with the authorities. You're the problem. America's guardianship system creates legalized discrimination, where people under the pretense of safety are denied access to basic legal, human, and civil rights and protective services. When your loved one becomes a ward and loses their right to life, the family members also lose their quality of life. Wards and family members are forced to spend the rest of their lives reacting to the injustices perpetrated against them, with no light at the end of the tunnel and no one to help. Even if you're fortunate enough, by the grace of God, like we were, to free yourself and your loved one, you'll never be free again. Your life is changed forever. Citizens do not deserve to lose their lives, their livelihood, and their family legacy to a dysfunctional system that's inadequately monitored. For seeking safety for me and my mother from a criminal enterprise, I am now labeled a criminal with a warrant out for my arrest. Had we not fled the country, my mother would not be alive today. Within 42 days of taking over, the Guardian had created a false scenario to lock my mother in a facility. Every attempt she or I made to seek justice was used to further punish and isolate my mother and to drug her into submission. She would say, "I'm not a criminal. I didn't do anything wrong. My 2 sons should be locked up, not me. Everything is upside down. She wasn't demented. She wasn't confused. She was right. Even more heartbreaking is when she would watch others walk by her window and say, "Look at them. Look at them. They're free. I can't even go for a walk. I can't feel the sun. Why? I'm a good person. What did I do to deserve this? You all should be ashamed of yourselves to do this to your mother. You can leave here and go home. Me, I'm locked up." That's not a statement that a severely demented person could formulate. Her next statement shows what guardianship isolation does to a ward. She said, "I am nothing. My own family, my own children threw me away." She still says that today. She'll never be the same. My mother is a survivor. Given back her freedom, love, and the right environment, she's bounced back to her vibrant, healthy self. She's 78, she doesn't have dementia, and has no need for medication. As of September 2018, both her pathologist and neurologist diagnosed her with mild cognitive impairment with the ability to manage her finances and her life. No different than before guardianship. Her right to prove it has been met with closed doors. The scars of betrayal at the hands of her own children, the professionals, the government, and 2 years of being falsely imprisoned are evident in the way she now chooses to live her life. Neither she nor I can ever fully recover the psychological and emotional scars, the physical decline caused by guardianship and the stress it causes, the family and financial losses, and especially the loss of time with our children. Our grandchildren have devastated me and my mother and our entire family. The US government, full of competent people, promotes protections for itself through a separation of power, a system of checks and balances, and the rule of law. The most vulnerable citizens in America are forced into a system that provides only the rule of law. My mother and I asked for help both in Minnesota and Arizona from senators, congressmen, attorney generals, the Department of Health and Human Services, law enforcement, civil and human rights organizations, the Board of Judicial Standards, disability law offices, ombudsmen, even world organizations, and even the president, all of which either ignored us or referred us to one another. It doesn't matter that my mother, left destitute and forced out of her own country, is forced to pay $200,000 in annual taxes to pay for the salaries of these powerful people. No one will do anything to protect her. As the Australian Association to Stop Guardian Abuse has said, by ignoring victims, we are conditioned to accept that the system owns us, that they have the power to take over our life and that of our family. Here's an example. The Minnesota Attorney General's response was that they don't investigate fiduciary fraud because it conveniently doesn't fall under the statutes that they investigate. After reporting to the Attorney General several times that my mother is denied the right to hire an attorney, the Attorney General's consistent recommendation was for my mother to hire an attorney. The burden of a national problem is left to individual wards to fight from a position of legal paralysis, false imprisonment, and a drug-induced state. The Guardian continues to pay the government the ward's taxes and is given the ward's right to vote. So there's no incentive for the government or government agencies to help. In our case, an Adult Protective Service investigation proved that severe abuses were taking place. As a result, the Guardian decided that he will get a court order so that my mother will never set foot outside of the facility again, and decided that I will never see her again. We had no plans to lose our lives to an enterprise of human trafficking and corruption. I refuse to grieve the death of my mother while she's still on this earth. With nothing but the shirts on our back, we ran for our lives. 2 days after we left, that court order was put into place. Even after we fled, no one will help us. The judge and guardian enjoy my mother's estate while deliberately pretending that they haven't been notified of her location, providing her no financial support whatsoever. The guardian canceled her debit card as soon as we left. Both the judge and guardian refused to give up guardianship. The judge said he would not allow my mother to hire an attorney unless she was present so he could see her improved condition. He never required my mother or asked for her presence when he removed all of her rights. In fact, at the hearing for permanent guardianship, the guardian forced my mother to see the doctor at the exact hour of the hearing so that she couldn't defend herself, knowing she was capable of doing so. At a later hearing, the judge refused her the right to testify because of the label of incapacitation that he had given her. We were both subject to retaliation when we were in the US by the guardian and the judge. Every attempt my mother made to stand up for her rights was used against her to further label her and to further restrict her. Even her right to fresh air and sunshine was taken away. I was ostracized, slandered, cyberbullied, and threatened with supervised visitation. After we left Minnesota and the country, the guardian used my mother's money to get himself guardianship in Arizona as well, while making no efforts to provide for his ward. He displayed his violence in front of the police by kicking down doors in our Arizona home and stealing my personal property, a disabled veteran, and there were no consequences, nothing. The guardian forced our home into foreclosure, causing me to lose an additional $30,000 I had put down as a down payment on the advice of my mother's Arizona attorney. Such violent acts, and yet the judge continues to give the guardian legal authority over more wards. During a court hearing before we left, the doctor, the guardian, and the facility director could not pinpoint what type of dementia my mother purportedly had. Yet the judge denied her further testing and determined that I'm unwilling to cooperate with the professionals. The doctor was a family practitioner specializing in obstetrics who elevated my mother's diagnosis in a 4-month period from mild cognitive impairment to severe dementia. The judge would not allow testing because it would prove that he and his colleagues unjustly labeled her incapacitated. Today, while pretending they don't know my mother's whereabouts, they benefit by having full control of her estate without the headache of providing for her, their commodity, or dealing with me, their liability. After we left, the guardian told a family member that whatever he spends to find my mother will be taken out of my inheritance. That's an empty threat, because the guardian will stay in probate until he, his attorneys, and the judge devour the entire family estate. The saddest part is that my mother and father were penniless when they migrated to the United States, and both worked long hours, not for material gain, but to provide security for their families that their own families had lost during the war. Minnesota's guardianship problem seems to be the best kept secret, hiding behind progressive programs that, from my perspective, are ineffective. The Conservator Account Auditing Program, or CAP, catches financial discrepancies, but the final decision is still left to the individual judge. Our judge overlooked all the discrepancies found by CAP and allowed the guardian to keep his $126,000 income, while simultaneously granting him authority over my mother's Arizona trust assets as well, and still denying my mother an attorney. That's the end of the line, the judges who operate with impunity. The bipartisan bill, the Court-Appointed Guardian Accounting and Senior Protection Act, to protect seniors from neglect and financial exploitation, is supposed to strengthen oversight of guardians and conservators. From my perspective, what it does is provide more money to the same people in power that are already exploiting seniors, It still leaves the final decision-making with individual judges. They get to decide if the person taking over your rights and your entire life will have a background check. I don't know any other profession that allows people to practice without an appropriate education, without a license, and without a background check. Once in guardianship, there are no protections from abuse, fraud, malpractice, neglect, assault and battery, exploitation. It begs the question, who thought up such a system? I often hear people say, there are good guardians. This is not something that should be left to chance. The current system is a roulette game, leaving citizens in an extremely vulnerable position without a system to monitor the players. There needs to be enough protections so that abuse is not an option. The criteria, the definition for incapacity and guardianship need to be revisited. No one, no matter how disabled, should be stripped of all of their rights with no protections. That's insanity. A huge problem is that there are no protections at the front end to protect citizens who don't need that level of protection from being forced into guardianship. Common sense would say that before a citizen's rights can be completely eliminated, you would need at least the opinions of 3 medical doctors and 3 mental health professionals and a functional assessment and an assessment of strengths and weaknesses. Currently, all it takes is 1 doctor to write a diagnosis of his choosing without your knowledge. What should scare all Americans and people around the world, because it happens worldwide, is that these vultures can swoop in any time for any reason. If you see a doctor, you can become a ward. If you're late on an electric bill, if you're admitted to a hospital, you're fair game. Even after death, if you die due to medical malpractice and there's an opportunity for a lawsuit, this right can be stolen from your family by the racketeers. If you're alive and win a lawsuit, you're fair game. Anything you have to offer, money, organs, a home, even a small pension, puts you in a category to be preyed upon. I don't care who you are or how thorough your estate papers are, that means nothing. Anyone, a family member, a neighbor, an attorney, a doctor, even an 18-year-old who passes a 40-hour online course and calls himself a professional can walk into a courtroom, erase your existence, walk away with your life and your finances, and destroy your family. I picture my mother's guardian sitting in his $700,000 home, laughing at how easy it is for him to defraud the elderly. Most people have no idea that this form of human trafficking exists until it's too late and they get caught up in it. Don't think that it can't happen to you. Me and my mother are on opposite ends of the financial scale. Her income in 2017 was $518,000, not including the assets behind that income. My disability income, $36,000, is just as tempting as my mother's estate, and I'm going to tell you why. A guardian has the legal right to pay himself 30% of a disabled veteran's income. I'm already 100% disabled, putting me in a very vulnerable position. All it would take is for me, by chance, to see a doctor, either civilian or VA, that's part of the racket. Currently, 1 doctor would only need to write 1 sentence in my medical record, unable to manage her finances and unable to care for herself. I would instantly become a ward and lose the freedom that I served my country for. You lose your life in this war. The benefit to the guardian is that he would earn $12,000 a year to pay my bills automatically through bill pay, which most of us can do ourselves, and throw me into a VA facility, costing him nothing out of pocket. To give the appearance that he's taking care of my needs, he would give me $100 a month for essentials and save up the remaining $1,900 a month until I die. Once I die and the savings account is worth 100,000, 300,000, it doesn't matter. The guardian will stay in probate until he and his attorneys and the judge use up the entire estate. Multiply that by 50 veterans, the average number of wards per private guardian. That's an easy $600,000 annual income with a multi-million-dollar pot of gold waiting to be picked up after the wards die. In all 50 states, it's a crime to abandon a dog, but it's not a crime to abandon the elderly and the disabled. America won't be great again until the government cares enough to investigate fiduciary fraud, remove wards from these guardianships, and provide protections for its most vulnerable citizens. President Trump has gone to other countries to free Americans from injustices. But what's being done in our own country? The US is trying to keep immigrants out, but is doing nothing to prevent its own citizens from having to flee the country. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. The human trafficking that is guardianship should be treated as a national emergency. America needs to wake up. The professionals that turn a blind eye need to realize that the wards were once the professionals. If they take no action, their turn is coming. Currently, the only option is to submit to human trafficking or, like us, accept defeat, give up fighting for your life's work and your family legacy, and run for your life. Be careful where you run, because the guardianship mafia has spread its wings all over the world, Australia, the UK. They found a legal way, the guardians, to murder and steal. They've taken advantage of the lack of citizen protections and infiltrated the legal system through corrupt professionals. If I make it sound like a conspiracy theory, it's not a theory, it is a worldwide conspiracy. People are turned into commodities and their family members are liabilities to be extinguished. You're no longer treated like a human being, you don't exist. The victims are treated like slaves, forced into medical experimentation, their body parts used for the organ trade. They are literally incarcerated and murdered, legally. The guardians count on the sandwich generation not having the time or the financial freedom to stand up to protect their parents and their inheritance. From my point of view, retirees that want to avoid being victimized by this racket have two choices. One, figure out how much you'll need to maintain the lifestyle you want and distribute the remainder of your estate while you're still alive. Or two, renounce citizenship, take your tax money with you and retire in another country. Choose wisely. The racketeer's tentacles reach far and wide. It's citizen action that will pull the plug. Changes will only be made when those in power are denied money. The government will only help us if they're hit in their pocket. If enough wealthy people, like my mother, renounce citizenship, stop paying taxes, and refuse to migrate to the large retirement communities in the United States, only then will we get someone's attention. I invite you to read the details of our story on the AAAPG website. If you've been victimized, our story will resonate with you and likely sound similar to your story. Don't be discouraged. No weapon formed against us will prosper. By banding together, we're gaining power and we are making a difference. I wish you all the best. Thank you.